pieces. I just want to record this section because we're keen to share this as a resource for other people who are unable to attend today. The bit where I want to start is just around just kind of introducing the content of the report and what you might, and for Joe in particular, if you haven't seen it or had a chance to look at it just yet. This is what it looks like. And so it was all about data-driven insights for advancing diversity. We appreciate data-driven is that we're trying to nut into who's done really thorough work on this, far more than you could if you were just an individual business. And there's some examples in here, like there's a UK study. They looked at they applied for 9,000 warehouse jobs, right? So the level of detail some organizations have gone to, or institutions, is extraordinary. And that's just one study of probably the 40, which we kind of touch on. So the piece, I'll kind of go beyond this bit. Just a real quick flag here. We're actually working on the next report ourselves. That's called the Inflection Point, where we're looking at the whole career path of a female in particular. And just because our expertise is around first-time leaders, and what we found is that what influences our kind of typical sweet spot, that being first-time leader, usually between 25 and 35, is impacted severely by pregnancy, having children, taking time out of work, and also getting picked up by internal recruitment processes. And so Inflection Point is about bringing some insights. Okay, what could you do before they get to the workforce? That's more of a kind of a government level kind of interest. And then what could you do as a company if you're trying to solve the issues of that kind of early first job, kind of early career stage? And then the second part being later in your career stage as well. All of those have different inflection points where if you get it right, you can have women stay, or if you get it wrong, you often have women leave. And so that's what we're kind of working on at the moment. So high level in terms of this report, gender equity, what's working. We looked at 243 academic papers, 26 case studies, 17 first-time leader programs, and about 5,000, approximately, that last figure, conversations with corporate leaders. And so the point was to not try and be the expert, but as we mentioned, just help business leaders navigate what is a really tricky conversation. We wanted to bring actually a male lens to this as well, and I mean that from opening up the conversation with men and do it in a way which appealed to men and was trying to remove some of the emotive language which often shows up at this time of year. And whenever you mention gender equity, I know since some of the posts I made, which many of you would have seen, I got called a communist. I got called, drinking propaganda, all this different stuff around this whole space. So it's quite loaded when it comes to a topic for men to engage with. And the key things we wanted to highlight again is to try and engage people again, because a lot of people, I think, have become cynical in this space, and International Women's Day is an amazing day, but often there's a lot of frustration around it. We had a couple of mentors kind of say, if I get past another cupcake again, I'm going to throw it at the person. And it highlighted for me, I was like, wow, that seems like a really strange thing to say about a day which in its inception in 1911 was about celebrating the amazing thing women do. And so I think it's a tricky day. We all know that. We're not saying anything which people don't know. So the point was the myths trying to grab the attention of the reader here. Happy to go into some of these, and you can download this full report for free on our website without even an email address. And the key points we're going to focus on here is that the week before, of course, the WGEA pay gap data came out. So not necessarily addressing the pay gap specifically in this report, but we wanted to ride the kind of attention wave that WGEA had kind of stimulated. And we picked on some of the data there. So there's clearly work to do in this space. Specifically, you can see there we've picked on boards, the company pay gaps, and then more broadly, the national gender pay gap. So again, this report doesn't necessarily speak to pay disparity, but it's an interesting one, and it was a topical piece. I think the most key thing is, and this is where we'll focus. So Joe, for you, if you want a quick summary about what you could do, or maybe some of the things which we wanted to highlight, we just wanted to do really kind of too long, didn't read summary of what doesn't work. So gender bias training consistently makes things worse. It doesn't mean it doesn't work completely, but I think what we wanted to highlight is that actually it's really not all it's made out to be, especially companies who are engaging around this International Women's Day and they're being encouraged to invest. The real danger is you just throw money at anything, and if anything doesn't work, then you do something that doesn't work, and then you kind of go, well, we tried, it's too hard. So we just wanted to socialize stuff which does actually work. Mums who show kiddie career breaks, as an example, they get less callbacks for jobs. That's a really interesting one. Topical things which you could easily move the dial on, and that's what we kind of go into. So that's the summary of what doesn't work. What does work, there's some really interesting things here. This one in particular, this scale piece, this is one which really kind of stood out to us when we were going through the research. If you go from a 10 out of 10 review scale in your workplace and you replace it with a 6 out of 6, you effectively remove any potential gender bias. What the research found is when they were doing reviews, if you have a 10 out of 10 grading, you're more likely, men were more statistically likely to achieve a 10 out of 10 rating. But if you made it just 6 out of 6, it removed any of the bias. I think this point's particularly poignant, is that a lot of companies, and there's a lot of the debate, is that, men are bad, or men shouldn't be like this, or this bias that, this bias that. The tricky thing about, or the best thing about this maybe, is that you don't even have to, we've all got biases. That's what the research demonstrates. It's almost impossible to kind of train someone to not have a bias. So arguably the best way to do it is to design a system where bias can be removed just by design rather than anything else, and not relying on the human component. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting. In a lot of the papers, it talked about how the bias training can slightly improve attitudes towards gender, but it didn't improve the behaviors, which was quite interesting. And so what we loved about things like this, where it was the performance rating and women were most likely in male-dominated fields to get an 8 out of 10 rating, was the most common rating. It actually can, I guess, circumnavigate that behavior of human beings. And even, it was really fascinating with the gender bias piece and unconscious bias. There was a whole element around it can give you a moral license to then continue with your biases because you've done the training. So for an example, there was another study that which looked at moral license, which said if people were given a placebo, others were given a health pill with lots of vitamins, and where they had the placebo or the health pill, it actually people ate worse food, smoked more, because they had this moral license of, I'm doing something good for my body, therefore I can misbehave in other ways. And the similar thing was happening here with moral licensing around unconscious bias. So I think having this focus on, is there behavioral design that we can implement so we don't have to, I feel like not worry about the biases, but we can interrupt it in something so simple of changing a scale. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money. And you think about the cost of implementing that versus training every single person in an organization. And the bias training that did work was practical role playing and repeated over time with lots of practice. So the investment for that is obviously much bigger compared to, say, something like this.
Great point. And essentially, that's what we wanted to arm business leaders with. There's something you can do, doesn't require overhauling your company, doesn't require millions of dollars of investments. It just means contacting your HR team and saying, hey, could we just switch out that 10 out of 10 to 6 to 6? And all of a sudden, you've got a significant difference. One of the great reports we found, so in here, I'll pick on this hiring talent one. I'll go to this one actually just briefly. And this is around marketing manager. So what was really interesting about one of these studies, they looked at 100,000 jobs advertised on LinkedIn. So the data set is mad. And they found that the applicants or job applications who showed the number of applicants on here increased the number of female applicants by 11.7%. So a female is more likely to apply for a job, which just shows the number. Not even
it wasn't even completed.
A big number. Yeah.
And it wasn't even completed. It was just that people had started the applications because it gave social proof that, oh, okay, this job is something that's going to be a good opportunity.
The high level stat, so it would have 11.7% more women start the application. And down here, it's got a 4.7 percentage point increase in completed applications in LinkedIn. But again, I think it's such a small thing to do. No one's really going to argue if you don't do that. And it can make a massive difference for companies in particular who are trying to attract more women. That can be quite a significant jump in many cases. I'm just going to go back one step. So this was this was the UK study I mentioned just previously. So a lot of people, and a lot of the response I got online to the post was a lot of the men were talking about, it's just about elite jobs, right? And you hear that quite a bit, you know, it's all about executive jobs or high paying jobs. This study itself, they applied for 9,000 warehouse packing jobs in the UK. Not well known for its high paying, being a warehouses person. And they did two things. They had 4 different CVs and they had applied to these jobs. On 2 of the CVs they displayed the fictitious person's experience in this manner. They said they're an assistant or in this timeline manner. I'm not sure they used the word mumming specifically, but that was my kind of creative license there. And then on the other 2 CVs, they had the other way of doing it. So instead of saying in 2017, I did this, 2020, I did this, 2021, I did this, they just said, I've been an assistant for 3 years and I've been a manager for 2 years. And that was it. They found that those who did it this way received a 13% uptick in the number of callbacks they got. Again, small thing, small difference, massive. If you look at a large scale in terms of we're thinking about societal level in what that might translate into in terms of opportunity, it's a very easy and obvious low-hanging fruit.
I think the interesting thing about this was, so the 13% refers specifically to mums who had a career break. They switched it to the 3 years, 2 years approach rather than the timeline. But then even people who didn't have a career break that switched their CVs to the 2 years and 3 years received an 8% increase in callbacks. So I think what's great about some of these studies too shows that these approaches can help everybody, not just say women with career breaks, but even people who didn't have a career break can increase their callbacks from jobs. So even for people, even for just women generally, or all genders, which I think is really cool about a lot of this research, is that you help women, but you also help everybody.
That's a great point. And I guess that's what we were trying to highlight, or kind of maybe it was the standout to us, is that gender equity, gender bias is often by men can be interpreted as like men need to be fixed. The reality is, and what the data shows is that, and this is a great one to pick up on that, is that the data shows it's not a man issue, it's a human issue, right? It's not like women don't have their biases. And so this is a fascinating study out of the US. They looked at 15,000 applications for the Hubble telescope. So Helen, you mentioned you're working this kind of with researchers and that kind of field. I think many of those researchers would be my assumption is that they're quite aware of this space in terms of the research that's happening in here. So they looked at all these applications and they looked at the different cycles of the application. So they tried different strategies to remove certain biases. So what they want, an example being, they would remove the first name, then they'd remove the second name, then they would remove the first name, second name, and the gender. And so they tried all these different things, and then the time when they did remove the gender, so they hid the gender on the application. This was when they got the first result here where it didn't discriminate against women. And so this gap here is that it would show that there was more likely the male applicants would get the chance to use the Hubble telescope as a way to do research. So what was interesting is the adjudicators, as it were, or the checkers for the applications were male and female. It wasn't like there was just purely male sat there in this kind of ivory tower going, we don't want women to come in. It was both of them were male and female. And the chance here was that they both demonstrated differences, both had bias, and each way it ended up going like this. So anyway, very fascinating stuff. And a really simple one, just anonymize gender at certain points in your process. So think about if you're doing reviews in your company, there's certain points where doing this might be highly effective. Probably easier in a big corporation. Smaller companies, it can be a bit tricky just from sometimes everybody in a small company. But I think at a big level, a large company can make a lot of sense.
And you might have heard this before. There's a classic study around what's a concert where people play instruments, an orchestra. Not good with my words. Orchestra. When you have an orchestra, they did the gender, anonymizing the gender, and it was actually super interesting. So they had people play behind a curtain to begin with, but then the gender wasn't anonymized because they could hear women walking in high heel shoes. So they had to get people to take off their shoes when they walked on the stage to then sit down and play their instrument. So they noticed that they actually, when they anonymized gender, swung the other way and got even more women into the orchestra. And so there was, it actually ended up being less men overall, which was quite interesting. But they were kind of the first people to really look, also first industry, I think, to really look at anonymizing gender. And it's a particularly tricky one when you have to hear people playing instruments rather than sending in a CV where you can actually, you know, take off those things on a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's great. Interesting. Glad we've got to the orchestra word. Great. So women negotiate salaries 17% lower. Again, I don't want to highlight too much into this. Can be what we were trying to do is provide some level of balance here. So we wanted to provide an interesting study. This one in particular was showing that there was 57 students, I think it was, or people at universities, probably a mix of students and staff. So they were put into a fake scenario, but they were offered a starting salary for a fake job, $40,000. And the study went into how well did each gender navigate the negotiation process. One of the biggest ones they saw was that women would expect more backlash, so they would kind of basically give up earlier in the negotiation than men. If you look at the difference, so men would achieve a 27% higher salary. So instead, I think women generally got to like $43,000 from $40,000 start. Men would get into the $50,000 range on a more regular and consistent basis. And one of the quick ways to solve this is actually have a female who would advocate for the other female as well. And so it's a really interesting thing. And that having another advocate in the space, whether it's male or female, then meant that you can neutralize any of this potential bias. And what's interesting, particularly about this, is that this is not a stat which is banded around when it comes to the WGEA pay gap much in terms of that negotiation piece. So kind of not saying this would solve that problem, but it's an interesting statistic which we haven't heard much about. Anything on that there?
Nothing done.
Cool. I am mindful this could go for hours if we kept going like this. I'm going to pause here I'll just speak to, there's 4 other sections which we've got here: promotion and retention, and we could go through a whole bunch of stuff in here. Navigating bias, so this kind of talks about how bias training hasn't worked or what it can do if you do it, and some of the kind of the drawbacks from it. There's a bunch of stuff in there in terms of like how to do it better. And so if you're looking for quick and easy ways, or if you're looking for more effective ways than others, then this has got things in there. It's got useful case studies around one of the best things you can do to move the dial in terms of perception is to hire a female CEO. So that can be very, very powerful. Westpac, just FYI, did an amazing job on actually moving the dial around gender equity in terms of the banking sector. They've got one of the most gender balanced companies. I don't want to say across the industry, but it was the case study is one of the first. It was very, very good. We've got one on performance. So how do you actually get females to engage and perform better, and how do you actually navigate that and encourage them to do so?
Not because their performance is good, it's around that perception of performance, which is quite interesting. And this study looked at some ways that you can actually get around that.
Yeah, this was a US study, I think, actually, and they talked about how they asked the female. They basically did this kind of test. It was, I think, it wasn't around IQ. It was around some sort of like quiz, and then they would ask the females, how did you think he went? And females, even though they would typically perform better than men, rated their performance at a lower level. So,
and this is something that we didn't include in the report, but there's some really fascinating research around if you are asking people questions, whether it's on a survey or, you know, during a test, if you ask people to put their gender at the beginning, if it is a female, they're more likely, say, for a maths test to do worse because there's a perception that females are bad at maths. There's even one on culture. So if you ask what race you are, Asian people will lean into the stereotype and actually perform better on a maths test when asked their race at the beginning. So just by moving that to the end, you can actually of the survey or the test that you're doing, you can eliminate some of those. And there was even another example around getting people to sign their name at the beginning, had people be more honest in, I think, job applications and other things like that too. So it can be some really simple design tweaks, and you can still get the same information and then have a better, less biased outcome.
Awesome. I'll pause here. I'd love to open it up to some questions. Is there anything? And I also would love to, a part of why we wanted to do this is to see what resonates most with people. So we would love to hear if you have any questions, but secondly, maybe what stands out to you most, maybe about the work we've done, or maybe some of the examples we've shared so far, just in terms of like I say, we're not experts in this field. We're enthusiasts, as you can probably sense from the speed we're talking at on this side. It's helpful to know this and understand it. Our mission as a company is to build the most effective first-time leader training on the planet. And we see that in order to do that, you have to understand this piece, because otherwise you can't stand that. You won't get a very effective program, because you'll be 50%, or it might be effective 50% of the people you're talking to. So that's our interest in this. But yeah, I might throw it over. Joe, you've just unmuted, so I might pick on you first if you felt comfortable.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's so great, such great work, and yeah, I really appreciated your LinkedIn post, Michael. I thought it was great. I said to Felicity the other day, like, just that willingness to be wrong, and we have such a toxic cancel culture. Like you really could have turned against you, and so yeah, keep doing it, even though I think
Thanks.
we need men to make mistakes, like in that space, and just be okay with it, just to kind of, because I think that educates. So anyway, but beyond that, I mean, I think that the things you've outlined are kind of things that I've heard before a lot, and part of me, I think that we need to come at this issue from a range of different directions, and I think all those things you suggested are really important. But at the end of the day, a lot of that is the onus back on the women. So like, we've got to change our resumes, we have to change the way, like, it's like we have to be more confident in ourselves, and we have to rate our performance better, and like the onus is still back on the women, and that's good for us. Like, we need to know that. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I think we need to do that too. But what are the structural things that organizations need to change is what I'm kind of really interested in, because certainly not anti-men. Like, some of the men at my institution have been more supportive. Certainly it was a man that put me into a leadership role in the first place. And it was a man that advocated for me consistently last year when I was going through issues. However, and I'm sure all the women know they've been the victims of bullying from women, but for me that's a structural, I feel like there's a structural thing there around. I also wonder, sorry, I'm thinking, let me take a step back, and I wonder sometimes around, I don't know whether this is a cynic in me or this is a woman not believing in herself, but sometimes I think I get more support from men because I'm not considered a threat. So a man is more likely to help a woman up because they're not necessarily thinking, oh, this person's going to take my job. They're thinking like, how can I, and I wonder whether women think they're more reluctant to help other women because we're seen as threatening. Like, there's only so many jobs for women, and I've got to keep my leadership role. And if I empower this young woman leader, that's the kind of cynic in me. I wonder about that. And I also think that, yeah, go.
So can I jump in there? So I think firstly, I hear what you're saying. And first of all, thank you for your comments around the post. Yeah, I definitely I text my wife many expletives after actually posting that post. Because it felt really raw to share that. And I certainly was ready. I was kind of bracing for impact in terms of how that might be received. The piece around the data, I would challenge what your perspective is in terms of how it might empower a man for what we've shared. I think there's two ways. If we take the job application piece, right? So you could look at it and go, well, women need to change their CV. I'd actually say where we were leaning was that if the data says that it's more likely to suggest against people, if you take LinkedIn as an example, the whole LinkedIn platform is built on started this date, ends on this date.
Yeah, yeah,
And actually, if the research demonstrates that that is
yeah,
causes emphasizes or creates a bias, I'd
yeah,
say a lot of men could influence how their recruitment process and how they capture information when it comes to applications.
yeah,
So I actually don't necessarily, I wouldn't say I disagree with your perspective. I would just say I think you can interpret the data in different ways. And what we wanted to highlight is go, this is what the data shows.
yeah.
And if you think about HR is not well known for a heavily masculine department.
No.
And so actually, it's a bunch of women who then arguably are discriminating unknowingly against their
Yeah,
own, right?
100,
So
100%. That's what I mean about structure. And it's like, because if there's something around policy and structure in workplaces that's stopping real change here.
right.
And I hear what you're saying, in that it is on the onus of the business, but how do I know, as an individual female, how do I know that that business has that policy? Like, I don't know that. So if I'm going to take action in this area, then I'll have to take those tips and tricks, which I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that's part of the picture. It's just what happens in the structure of an organization that is. And I think at the end of the day, you're still if you're interviewing that person's going to come in and going to be a female, and you're going to go, oh, like I've had a female, and I certainly, Michael, have had worse treatment from women than I have from men. I was a female leader that I came up against my supervisor and said, like, I need to apply for a promotion, I need to be in leadership roles, and you keep not putting me in leadership roles, and I've asked you to. And she said to me, well, you've got young kids and I know how hard it is. I said, well, that's not your decision, that's my decision.
Mm.
So there are definitely females who make decisions about other females. So certainly am not here to male bash at all. I just think, culture and structure and policy is what's going to make the biggest difference.
Correct. And I think, Joe, like the most unhelpful, I think, the languaging we're using is by making it a female thing. Like you saying, I've had a female do this, I've had a male do this. The reality is we've had other humans who that's the reality of it, right?
Yeah, and I was just trying to make, I just said that to make an example of, like, certainly I agree with you. When I'm not saying I'm here. I just think there's cultures as well that keep women down, very negative cultures, and they're kind of patriarchal structural cultures, which is not helpful for any human, let alone female or male or whatever. Yeah.
And if you take, I saw a guy in the UK last night. Over in the UK, I think it's like 98% of people who take parental leave, the government parental leave, is a female. And his point was, I just don't believe that's the only ones who want to take parental leave, right? And there's definitely a growing group of men. I was on a bike ride the other day. I came to the top of a hill, huffing and puffing, took a break, and I overheard this conversation of three men. And the guy was like, hey, I really, really want to spend more time with my kids. And they were talking about how they could spend more time with their children and adjusting their work. And so I was like, this is really interesting.
Side point on policy, like I've talked a lot, so I'll just make this, but in Sweden, right? So I spent a couple of months in Sweden, and this was like when was I in Sweden? 2008. So this was a while ago. Their maternity leave policy was you get 18 months paid, but only if a man takes 6 months. Otherwise, you get 12 months. So that or the other carer, right? So it was like if the main carer took they got 12 months, but if both carers took some of that leave, then they got an extra 6 months. So it's policies like that then allow the the other carer to kind of step up. So
I think so. Yeah, you bang on, Joe. And I think to your point, gender equity fails when it becomes a female issue.
100%.
And that's what we were trying to do. I don't think this report necessarily speaks to how do we engage men in this conversation. That's something we're thinking about doing next year, is because arguably the biggest proponents at International Women's Day should be men, because again, we all have friends, wives, daughters, etc. and if gender equity stays and remains as just a female issue, and they need to fix themselves, and you just become increasingly frustrated that no
Yeah.
progress, then we're going to fail on this piece. That's all. So
I don't think you need to wait till next year. 18th of November is International Men's Day. Like, what can
okay,
we
cool.
do on International Men's Day to like bring forward things like men's mental health, or men wanting to be carers, or like other issues that affect, you know, other issues that the patriarchal system impacts on men. That's what I like. I would love more men to be involved in International Women's Day, but I would love even more for men to embrace International Men's Day in like a non-toxic way, like not in a rah-rah, let's play footy, drink beer way, but like, how do we like address those issues that are very pertinent to men? And they are, like suicide rate, like lots of things really impact men in our society. I would love that to be like looked at as well. I think that would help women.
Joe, it's great. I'm going to just throw to somebody else just because. Helen, I might pick on you just because you've got your camera off. That's all. And I don't know if you can speak or would be open to sharing. If not, that's totally fine.
Yeah, no, listening here in the background. Yeah, very insightful, in particular around the bias training. So the fact that, you know, great, tick the box, we've done bias training, but it's the repeatability, the role play, that continuous learning aspect, and that you found a case study that says that that's really effective. I thought that's quite effective, because I know that that's come up a lot of times in my organization where there is some gender-based issues and certain people kind of just aren't getting it.
Yeah.
And so that role play piece. Some of the other things I had kind of heard before, so I've probably read the same case studies as
Yeah, cool, great.
So yeah, and I know, yeah, there is, as Joe mentioned, there's sometimes some really structural based things and just working through those. So yeah,
awesome,
great guys work.
That's great. Thank you, Helen. Adele, welcome. Just want to shout out, it looked like you're on a ski slope. So I wish I was there. That looks great. So
thanks, Michael. It was in my calendar for the next hour.
Okay.
Well, we've recorded it so you can watch the recording.
That's
and we're
it.
just doing a Q&A insight. So maybe you have questions that you think about before you come, but
give her a moment to at least get settled. Like it's
Thanks.
Nick, I might throw to you briefly. Anything which stood out in particular? Any questions you might have?
I think there's some great takeaways. Like there are some actual insights to take away. One of the things, whether it's just my experience, but my health in research, is they talk a lot about like vicious cycles versus virtuous cycles. And I feel like in the workplace, it's like, it's not usually like, or it can be one experience, but usually like it's a number of experiences to keep people in the workforce. And they have a number of these poor experiences and then they leave, and trying to turn those around by just these little tweaks turns it into a virtuous cycle rather than it degrading into, you know, losing that diversity. Yeah. I did have one question. Obviously, you've read 243 academic papers. Is there anything that now you have all this information that you think something's missing? Is there something that you would want to read more about or have research done in?
Yeah, I can speak to that. The men's part in this, right? So I think there is probably the number one question I got for my response was, how do we engage men in this conversation, right? And I think it was shared. The post has had 143 people share it, or 148, something like that. I think it was 143 when I did the count. 21 men reposted the post and 121 women reposted it, right? So
that was surprising, I thought.
See, I wasn't necessarily surprised about it because it kind of highlights the issue that men find it difficult to talk about this topic. Women really want men to talk about this topic, but they don't know how to get them engaged. So I think the biggest one is that we can prove, we can demonstrate, we can find lots of really interesting things that bias exists. The really tricky thing is, well, how do you translate that from a factual finding in an academic paper and turn that into a systemic change? Which isn't a let's reprogram women, because that's as ineffective as let's reprogram men, which is the equivalent of doing gender bias training, right? So we're finding both of those strategies pisses each other off. Either women have to do all the hard labor and change their CV, as Joe beautifully highlighted, or men have to do the hard labor and try and not be biased over here. Okay, well, that neither of those, both of those actually entrench views, is what the research seems to demonstrate. Okay, well then, what is the more effective strategy? And I don't even think it's a men's issue. How do you best get people on board with something which doesn't necessarily impact them, right? That's actually the key point here. And this is no different that if you think about, Joe touched on it, men's suicide. How many women are banging down the door to stop men's suicide happening? More men die from suicide than the whole road death toll in the country, right? That should be an alarming statistic, but if you ask most women, I would say, well, not many of them have probably been to a march about men's suicide. The question is, do women don't care about that statistic? I think there would be an uninformed answer to get to. I think the best answer to get to is that actually it's hard for us as humans to really engage on a topic which doesn't directly affect them, right? They can get it at a conceptual level, but there's something different when you're disadvantaged by that. I know I'm on a men's board for a men's charity called Men's Wellbeing. I've been through depression. I've dealt with. I've been suicidal. I'm directly affected by the issue, so I'm more passionate about it. Right? There's no different to the gender equality thing, but we have to get better as a population. Well, how do we actually engage people about topics which they haven't experienced, can't experience, will never experience? How do you bridge that gap and that divide? Does that make sense, Nick?
Yeah. Just two other things. First of all, you deserve a round of applause for not having an email to download your report.
Thank you.
That's a big thing. And the other one is
why do you say that just briefly? Because
agree. a lot of things you click on and then you've got to sign up and then you're part of an email list. It's a minimizing friction. I was able just to click, bang, there's the report.
Awesome.
Makes it simplifies access to the information. The other thing was, do you think companies, I know whether it's in the reports, are companies being honest within their own organizations about this? And where that question comes from is, like, you get to International Women's Day and when I was working in the industry, but no one's really saying, everyone goes, we know we've got this problem or we know we need to go solve this, but they're not saying, hey, this is like our data. It's like whether they're too scared to say, well, actually, we haven't improved for the last 5 years. But I feel it's like that one blip on the calendar, but then they're not really reporting on it. They're not really educating or communicating to employees, whether they're doing well or whether they're doing poorly. They're not really accepting the truth of what's happening in their organization. And if anyone else.
It's a really interesting point, Nick. And a few years ago, I went to the Mao Champions of Change meeting, and it was for engineering companies. So it was most of the design houses, and they asked me to present around the work I'd done to engage schoolgirls into engineering, and they all needed to present their data. So the action from the previous meeting was to go away and have a look at it. And what was so fascinating is they'd come to the meeting with the data, but they said, "Now what? Like, what do I do?" And they left the meeting without action. And this is many years ago, and I think there's more that's been done in this space. But it was interesting that they were all CEOs of these big engineering firms, and they just didn't know what to do next. So I think there's definitely a gap. And in the conversations I had recently over the last couple of weeks since the WGEA data's been out around the pay gap, is a lot of companies have been talking about, like, for example, I think it was the Port of Brisbane. I went to one of their events. They said, where our gender pay gap's, I think, 20%, it was 30%. This is the improvement that we've made over this time frame. So I think the conversation had started to shift from here's the data to here's how we're not great, there's work to do, and here's how we're improving. So I have seen a slight positive shift, but then again, I also feel like I'm in those rooms where they're preaching to the converted, where I'm on board, so it's likely there's going to be a lot of those same people. I'd say, even to extend that thought, is I think often need to be talking to the people who aren't in the room as well as the ones that are in the room. I know that's a part of your question, but I think that's important too, because we're often getting the same people, like on this call. Like, I love that so many of you have heard about so much of this research, because there was lots in there that I hadn't heard about, and feel like I've been having this conversation for at least 12 years around gender equity. So I think that's awesome that a lot of you have heard a lot of this research. Yeah. Anything to add, Michael?
Yeah, I think the short response, Nick, I don't think it's lack of honesty which is happening. I think it's lack of conversation, because you can't talk about this topic without offending anyone. I'm sure we've already offended someone, right? A comment I've made may sound flippant, may sound disingenuous, may sound like we're trying to get someone to fix themselves, etc., etc. You just can't have this conversation without stepping on toes. And if you look at corporates, take Woolworths, right? They wanted to make a stand around Australia Day, and that's how it was interpreted, right? I'm not saying I'm not personally. I'm not a huge fan of what Woolworths did around that. But that's beside the point. When corporates take action, there's significant consequences. If you've got to protect and retain shareholder value, then that's what the job of the directors is, essentially, more than anything else. Okay, well then the best thing to do is just have to stay quiet. And so if we can't talk about this topic, we're not going to make progress. That's the reality. We can't learn. If there's no conversation, there's no learning. I've learned bucket loads since I made that post. I've had people from the UK reach out from France. I've been told I was wrong. I've been called I was a communist, and I've heard different perspectives, right? I've learned a lot because I was open, and I had 67,000 people have engaged around the topic, which I never had. And was my first topic. It was first post ever on gender equity. High bar. So the point is, if we don't talk about it, we will never learn. And I would question whether we don't really encourage conversation, because having a courageous conversation looks like imperfect. Whenever a company, take an engineering firm to pick on that sector, they're always going to look bad because the pipeline of talent moving into engineering is not 50-50. So they're always going to appear to be behind the 8 ball, even if they are the most demanding on their trying to get 50-50 balance, right? It's just so what can they do? So they're always going to look like they're behind. They're always good. So I think the conversations, I don't think it's a lack of honesty, Nick, because I think if you speak to CEOs, speak to executives, there's a lot of appetite for change. There's a lot of willingness, but to do that publicly, no, I don't think they're, and I'm not sure if we were a big company, I'm not sure I'd be so courageous and bold to be having the conversations we are, to be frank.
It does help that we run the business, so we get to say. So
yeah, we're not going to get sacked, right?
Yeah.
That's
No, that's great.
Thank you for questions, Nick, and appreciate you always think deeply about the topics that we talk about. So thank you for being in the discussion.
Mindful of the time, we said we would go for an
gosh.
hour. We've gone for an hour. We're going to wrap it up. If people, Adele in particular, if you had further questions, we'll stick around. But by all means, thank you so much for taking an interest. We're going to stop the recording now. And look, yeah, thank you so much for taking interest, reading a report, engaging in this topic. That's the more thing. What we're trying to do is stimulate conversation, try and get people to disagree with us, be willing to be disagreed with, and encourage imperfect action. If you take nothing from it, imperfect action in this area is exactly what's needed, because you learn by doing. You don't just learn by just theorizing all the time and taking note. And when you take action, you may get it wrong, and that's okay. And I think we should do more to make more mistakes in this space. That would be my general encouragement. So
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here.
all right, we'll stick around, but we'll just pause the recording. That's cool. If there's anyone else, if you got to rush off, by all means, if